Red 2 standing by, all 4 lit and in the green. Welcome back to Goldeneye. We are heading to the second mission, well, the second part of mission 2, the bunker, which is being constructed slowly but surely beneath Seven Ire for Goldeneye operations. We can actually pick up another cheat on 00 Agent here, but we're going to see a few things play out a little differently. We will actually meet Boris. Apparently the developers must have liked Boris quite a bit because he's a lot more helpful in this. It's a little unusual, but just how things go. The objectives in this will change quite a bit depending on which version you play. So, we will start off on Agent as always. We'll prepare the lesson and yeah, we'll just get going on whatever needs to be done. Primary objectives on Agent are to copy the Goldeneye key and leave the original and photograph the main video screen. A spy satellite has detected increased levels of activity at an old observatory complex near Seven Ire in Russia. Is this... that's the same as... hang on, is that the same as Surface? Yes, it is. So the background is the same. .007, I want you to infiltrate this base and find out what the devil's going on there. The satellite photographs reveal that there has been recent underground excavation. We'd like to know the exact nature and planned extent of the workings. By the way, this is a covert operation. You may have to neutralize the security, but try not to be too obvious about it. You'll be doing some computer hacking on this mission, 007? I know you'd rather be cracking open a bottle of bubbly than cracking passwords, so I've taken the liberty of putting together a little gadget which will do the hard work for you. If you attach the data thief to their mainframe, it should override any computer security measures and download the information we require. Underground in Siberia, James. Some of us don't get any further than the Northern Line. I didn't know what that meant until I realised, oh wait, it's the underground. Now, unfortunately, we are not going to find a jukebox in Siberia. Anyway, the lesson is ready. Let's get going. I will be completing all 3 difficulty settings and then going for the cheat. Over the years, across page and screen, James Bond has done battle with many notorious villains sporting a wide array of sinister schemes. I will primarily be focusing on the villains as written by Fleming here, save for Spectre. This organisation deserves its own episode. Fleming once observed that Bond saving the girl from the villain was in a sense a clash between the good and bad Ian Fleming, perhaps best embodied by Fleming bestowing his date of birth upon Blofeld. All of his villains, in addition to their many sinister actions and mannerisms, possess something physically off about them. Many are on the ugly side or look otherwise unusual. Even Emilio Largo, perhaps one of the more traditionally handsome villains, sports overly large hands. Perhaps there is some old homage to the debunked belief of beauty equaling goodness along the way, and admittedly it's not uncommon. This belief is almost always used in Fire Emblem, save for Binding Blade where you can actually recruit an ugly bandit. But if you can recruit somebody from the enemy ranks, they actually have a proper portrait and look pretty good. But I'm sort of diverting there. The first villain in the franchise, Le Chiffre, certainly does not look easy on the eyes. He is described as rather obese, standing only 5'8", which perhaps enhances this, and has red-brown hair and dark brown eyes. He smokes a lot and occasionally uses a Benzedrine inhaler. Fleming based some aspects of his appearance on the British occultist Aleister Crowley. Le Chiffre goes by many aliases, all of which are variations of the number or the cipher, since he is, by his own description, just a number on a passport, a stateless person's passport at that. His plans come across as fairly low-key. He's the financier of a French communist trade union connected to Smersh's operations and has been on the take. He intends to win his wasted money back at the titular Casino Royale. Bond's objective is to bankrupt him, destroying the trade union. He ultimately does succeed with a little help from Felix Leiter, but is captured thanks to what we later find is a betrayal by Vesper Lind. As would become a series trend, Bond is subjected to torture, also receiving the first example of a villain's attempt at a breaking speech in the series. Interestingly, it seems to work. After the torture is ended by the intervention of a Smersh agent sent to kill Le Chiffre for his failures, Bond's recovery sees him musing on the nature of good and evil and his job with the intent to retire. Only after Vesper's suicide does he become hell-bent on shattering Smersh. Live and Let Die sees Bond dealing with another Smersh financial operation, this time involving treasure smuggling. Running the operation, along with a powerful and wide-reaching criminal network among the black community, is Buonaparte Ignace Gallia, known as Big Boy in his youth and even now Mr. Big or the Big Man. He is certainly physically imposing but does have some oddities in his appearance. His head is described as being twice as big as normal, with no eyebrows and no eyelashes, and eyes so far apart one cannot focus on both. His skin is a grey-black, Fleming describes it as akin to that of a week-old corpse in the river, and he also has gold-coloured eyes. Despite the size of his head, it is not out of proportion. Mr. Big lives up to his name, standing 6'6" and weighing 20 stone, though, unlike Le Chiffre, barely any of that is fat. Mr. Big controls his operation through fear and myriad superstitions regarding voodoo beliefs. The book makes it appear no one in the black community is willing to risk crossing him or even give the slightest detail away for fear of savage retributions. Even M, who's pretty much that classic... Well, he would have fairly Victorian attitudes, including a fair bit of racism and attitudes similar to colonizers, has a begrudging element of respect for his capabilities and scope of operations. While the overall approach to voodoo is somewhat westernized, well, probably a lot westernized, Mr. Big has used these beliefs to give himself an aura of invincibility by spreading the rumour he is a voodoo zombie serving Baron Samedi himself. Solitaire explains the superstitions behind this, the reinforcement of the rumours with a fetish, in the classical sense, of Baron Samedi by Mr. Big's desk and the absolute terror he generates. His operation has an impressive reach, with his operatives having control over Harlem and bases in Florida and Jamaica to facilitate the smuggling operations, even being able to easily strike at a train on which Bond and Solitaire are travelling. Even without Solitaire's powers, the organisation's skills seem uncanny, and those who cross them meet dire fates. Mr. Big's man in Florida, the Robber, is responsible for Felix being thrown to sharks. While Leiter survives, which we only learn in Diamonds Are Forever, the Robber does not, being on the receiving end of Bond's vengeance. Mr. Big's operation is ultimately thwarted at the treasure hoard when the limpet mine Bond planted on his ship explodes. The villain is mauled by the barracudas and sharks lured to the area by the keel hauling of Bond and Solitaire. Thankfully, the two escaped severe injury on the nearby reefs. Sir Hugo Drax, the villain of Moonraker, comes across as very much the jovial and entrepreneurial British hero, a man whose ambitious plans will restore England's prestige and power on the world stage via the titular rocket. He is a larger-than-life character, tall and broad-shouldered, with red hair and a moustache styled to hide the scars of reconstructive surgery. One eye is left somewhat open and is quite bloodshot, perhaps due to an error in surgery, and his front teeth are also noticeably splayed along with a protruding upper jaw, which the moustache helps hide. Behind this bold and sometimes boorish facade is a sinister scheme. The real goal of the Moonraker is the destruction of London via nuclear warhead. Drax is actually a German count who worked for the Nazis, operating behind enemy lines on sabotage missions. During one of these missions, he was inadvertently bombed by his own side and suffered serious injuries. English soldiers found him and brought him to hospital, where plastic surgery was used to restore his features. By pure chance, the name of a missing English soldier was similar to his own. From Graf, or Count, Hugo von der Drasche to Hugo Drax, and from the humble Liverpudlian background of Drax to a hero of England. Naturally, this aspect would make his revenge all the sweeter, and on the day of the Moonraker launch, documents were to be released revealing Drax's true intentions, plunging a dagger into the heart of England. Drax's staff, perhaps unsurprisingly, all have German backgrounds as well, or so we would believe. Many rocket scientists in the space race were defectors from Germany or had worked on projects such as the V-2 rockets. His backing, on the other hand, comes from the Soviet Union. Precisely why the Soviets have assisted an ex-Nazi in the construction of such a potent weapon system is unclear. Maybe they don't know, but it's still possible they could have been a target someday, so not the brightest move there. Ultimately, Drax meets his end in a rather nasty fashion. The fully armed Moonraker is redirected to its original destination, also Drax's rendezvous point with the Soviet submarine, by way of Gala and James Bond redirecting everything. Dropping a nuke on someone sure is one way to dispose of them, and there is a bit of collateral damage, but according to M, the prevailing winds are taking the radiation back to Russia. The antagonists of Diamonds Are Forever, brothers Jack and Serafimo Spang, have never been adapted to the silver screen, though their henchmen Wint and Kid have. Perhaps this is because they're ultimately just mob bosses, far less outlandish foes than Bond normally encounters, and in terms of physical appearance they don't have anything really exaggerated. Bond himself has some fairly derogatory views towards Italian Americans, even if both M and Felix Leiter advise him to be cautious due to the power the Mafia and various gangs actually hold. Jack initially seems relatively harmless, being the true identity of diamond merchant Rufus B. Say. In fact, it seems like he knows barely anything about diamonds, as is revealed when Bond briefly investigates him with the help of Scotland Yard. In truth, Jack is ABC, the mysterious overseer of the diamond smuggling pipeline's origins in Africa and controller of many of its operations. Tiffany Case receives orders from him. Over in America, Serafimo and the Spangled Mob receive the diamonds and ensure the payouts for their operatives are made in clean money via fixed results at casinos, or possibly in horse racing. Anyone who crosses the organisation is dealt with severely, as Bond finds out after he and Leiter decide to mess with the method Bond is meant to receive his money through. The jockey they bribed to ride foul in a race, riding atop a ringer, is smothered in scorching mud at a mud bath post-race. Bond doesn't pick up on the fact that something's wrong until it happens, but he does at least get a useful visual on Wint and Kid. These two have more distinct characteristics than the Spang brothers. They're enforcers from Detroit and said to be particularly dangerous. The literary Wint is rather stout, has a wart on his thumb at which he frequently sucks, and bears a note on his luggage apparently stating his blood group is F. Kid has stark white hair despite being only 30 years old and is mentioned to be gay. This aspect admittedly plays a minor part in the book, though even then some homophobic attitudes still manage to rear their head. Perhaps the most notable element of the Spang brothers is that they are the first major villains to be personally dispatched by Bond. Jack is killed at the end of the book when Bond shoots down his helicopter with an anti-aircraft gun, while Serafimo gets one of the more spectacular demises in the series. The train on which he has pursued Bond and Tiffany, a beautiful Wild West locomotive, is derailed, and as he tries to keep some measure of control, Bond shoots him 4 times. The train then careers down a mountainside, crashes down a disused mineshaft, and explodes on hitting the bottom. A definitive and somewhat less environmentally impactful finish compared to the last book. From Russia with Love has a number of villains involved in its sinister scheme. At the helm is the leader of SMERSH, General Griboza-Boyshikov, General G for short, a man with sharp features, brown eyes described as being like polished marbles, beneath thick black eyebrows, a naturally grim expression and a clean-shaven head. With the assistance of fellow officers involved in Soviet intelligence, he puts the gears in motion for the plan which will entrap and destroy James Bond. Creating the ultimate scheme is the cold and dispassionate Kronstein, a master chess player who sees people as little more than pieces to be moved around a gigantic board. Kronstein is dedicated to his game and strives to ensure his cover is complete. He does not rush to assist the general since he knows people would be highly suspicious. Even his leaving immediately after his championship victory would prompt some questions, which he intends to cover in a manner which is mentioned but worded ambiguously. The plan is to set a trap with a beautiful defector, and the Spectre decoding machine. The unwitting beauty will seduce Bond, an encounter which would secretly be filmed and later put into her belongings along with a blackmail letter. An assassin would kill both of them, take back the decoder, and leave the incriminating evidence to be discovered, disgracing Bond and MI6. Suitable bait is found on the orders of Colonel Rosa Klebb. At first, Fleming obscures the identity of Colonel Klebb. It is later revealed the merciless head of the Soviet torture department is a woman, and in typical Fleming villain fashion, gets a suitably ugly appearance. She is rather squat and dumpy, described as toad-like, but also a compelling and menacing presence through her mannerisms and actions. Fleming also wrote Klebb as a lesbian, perhaps in order to increase a feeling of repulsiveness towards her in readers of the time. It is also horrifying for Tatiana to have such a conventionally loathsome individual attempt to seduce her. There's nothing wrong with being a lesbian, it's just that Fleming wrote her as being rather ugly because that's how Fleming wrote his villains. They were physically ugly. The intended executioner is Donovan Red Grant, named after the strongman who fathered him, styling himself the mighty O'Donovan. Interestingly, one of the young Bond books actually has a reference to this, and having a strong reddish tinge to his skin. Grant is a murderous psychopath who suffers violent urges around the time of the full moon. His killings started out with animals but then moved on to other people. His boxing training at the time usually served as a suitable cover story, but when he entered the Signal Corps after World War II, he disguised the urges with drink. Eventually he managed to defect and underwent training in all aspects of the Soviet mechanisms of death. He was meant to be killed originally, but became quite well regarded because he was an assassin who never tired of killing, never suffering the burnout which affects normal soldiers. Even James Bond finds killing exasperating sometimes. Grant meets Bond while disguised as a British agent, carrying a copy of War and Peace which actually has a gun built into it. It's fired by pressing a point on the book's spine. Unfortunately for Smersh, Grant is a great killer but doesn't appear to be overly smart. Bond is able to outmaneuver him by deflecting the fatal bullet with a hidden cigarette case, then overpowers him and turns the disguised gun back on its wielder. Klebb is ultimately dealt with, being arrested by Rene Mathis and Deuxième personnel, sorry for pronunciation, at the rendezvous point intended for Grant, but she still got the last word. She lashes out with a poisoned knife hidden in her shoe, and if Fleming had his original way, this would have been the death of James Bond. However, 007 would ultimately return in Dr. No, during which M dismissively acknowledges that Klebb died. No word comes of Kronstein's fate, and General G never returned in Fleming's books. Speaking of Dr. No, this antagonist is half German and half Chinese, and is a former treasurer of a Tong Syndicate, a major Chinese criminal organisation. He attempted to raid the treasury and abscond, but was hunted down even in jail and had his hands cut off to mark him as a thief before being shot through the heart. Or so it seemed. Dr. No apparently has dextrocardia, a rare condition which places the heart on the right-hand side of the body. Surviving his encounter, he was able to have claw-like pincers made to replace his hands. He also wears contact lenses as a side note. These don't seem to have been overly common back then. Dr. No's scheme involves using radio signals to disrupt American space launches, operating under the cover of a bird sanctuary and guano harvesting operation on Crab Key. In fact, several people from a number of bird societies wound up meeting some unfortunate ends. There was an accident which made quite a few people suspicious. His men patrol the area fiercely, using equipment such as the flamethrower-equipped Dragon Tank, and his criminal operations can spread even into Jamaica proper. When Strangways attempts to investigate a number of goings-on at Crab Key, his iron routine is fatally disrupted by 3 of Dr. No's assassins. His secretary is also killed and the MI6 station is burned to the ground. The assassins never appear again in the book. Bond ultimately escapes the elaborate death course Dr. No has created in order to try and test the limits of human endurance. Honey was supposed to be clawed to death by crabs, but that didn't work and they just left her alone. Bond winds up getting to the very last stage, somewhat ridiculously fighting a giant squid, and manages to use the legitimate cover, Crab Key's guano harvesting operations, against the not-so-good doctor, burying him under a massive pile of guano. Crushed and suffocated by bird droppings, what a way to go. If Auric Goldfinger is popular, it's really due to the movie. In the book, he's still quite obsessed with gold, but rather than being English, he originally comes from Latvia. He's actually quite short as well and also sports reddish hair. His gold smuggling operations allow him to serve as a foreign banker of sorts for Smersh. Something tipped him off in his younger days and he was able to escape with plenty of money hoarded, and he's been hoarding money, serving as a treasurer ever since. He's not satisfied with the wealth he earns from his operations. He plans to rob Fort Knox of its gold supply, which would have the side effect of causing economic chaos in the West. If only it were practical. Practicality isn't this Goldfinger's strong suit though. Despite having the help of various mob bosses promised to cut of the profits, the scheme is realistically immensely difficult to pull off, even if he was able to go through with the part of his plan which would see the population of the city near Fort Knox killed. The worst part is that for some reason, he elects to keep Bond and Tilly Masterson alive and make them help out with his plan even though he knows they're dangerous. Bond of course gets details out to Felix Leiter and the plan is ultimately thwarted. Nobody actually winds up suffering from the chemical weapon attack Goldfinger intended to use. Oddjob is very different in the book, especially compared to this game where Oddjob is ridiculously short. The literary Oddjob stands at 6'6" and is a master of many martial arts, on top of being a good aim with the famous bowler hat. His being Korean gets him subject to a lot of racist attitude from Bond, and even Goldfinger describes the Koreans as the cruelest people in the world, complete with a scene which pretty much states Oddjob eats cat meat. While Goldfinger explains it as being a taste picked up during a famine, you can't help but think it's still pretty racist. I don't really regard the literary Goldfinger that well. He's not that special compared to the rather intelligent cinematic incarnation. Interestingly, it's Oddjob who winds up being sucked out of the plane window in the book. Bond somehow stabs through a window, Oddjob gets sucked out, and Goldfinger winds up getting strangled to death by Bond. Side note, Oddjob actually has a cleft palate rather than being silent. Only Goldfinger is actually able to understand him. It really is weird seeing Goldfinger's treatment of these two, the literary version anyway. Everybody's going to think of the movie version, and that's much better because the plans are better. Oddjob is presented a bit better with a lot less racist attitude, and things just seem a bit smarter. And now onto For Your Eyes Only. We have very little to go on in terms of physical appearance regarding Major Gonzalez, the driving force in the titular short story. He's representing von Hammerstein in an attempt to acquire the Jamaican residents of the Havelocks, good friends of M and family owners of their house for around 300 years. Von Hammerstein is fairly well described though, with a typical repulsive approach as Fleming would give many villains. Von Hammerstein is shortish and going to fat, excessively hirsute on his body yet none on his head, and Prussian features contrasting with close-set eyes. He is an ex-Gestapo agent who has sought to hide his wealth in property and other investments as power changes in Cuba. His recent boss, Batista, seems to be on the verge of being deposed. This was the guy who got kicked out by Castro. Von Hammerstein is shot in the back by Judy Havelock's bow, and Bond dispatches Gonzalez and his two subordinates. Christatos in Risico does not have much of a description given, but we do receive information about the jovial and larger-than-life Enrico Colombo at least. We can go into details about him later. Christatos attempts to have his rival disposed of by feeding false information to Bond. However, Colombo is able to prove that it's Christatos who is behind the drug smuggling ring Bond is investigating. Bond assists in the raid on Christatos' warehouse, which provides concrete proof, and 007 is able to kill Christatos as the latter attempts to flee in his sports car. The third antagonistic figure is Milton Crest, and even then he's not really an antagonist as we'd think of it in a Bond story. He's a tough macho type who has suntanned features, is fit in appearance, and has slightly hooded eyes with a contemptuous gaze. He's mostly an antagonist in that he's a fairly rude and unpleasant person. The Hildebrand rarity deals with the Crest looking for a particularly rare species of fish, and generally most of the evil we are shown is his misogyny and his willingness to damage and destroy countless other fish using a certain chemical that will kill them off and allow him to find his rare fish easily. Crest ultimately meets his end when the very fish he sought is mysteriously shoved down his throat and the spines further impale him. Bond is not responsible, but does maneuver the corpse overboard to spare the possible suspects any trouble from the authorities. We never find out who did it. The main antagonist of The Spy Who Loved Me is never seen. We know his name, Mr. Sanguinetti, and we know he is seeking to burn the motel down and set it up as an accident for an insurance scam. To ensure Vivienne Michel is a fitting patsy, he sends two enforcers, Slugsy Morant and Sol Horowitz, to do the job and prove fitting menaces. Slugsy is short and stocky and has alopecia, not a hair on his body according to the explanation of the condition. As a result, he often winds up catching colds very easily and tends to sniffle a lot. He looks merely unpleasant to Vivienne, whereas Horror, who is described as deadly, is tall and thin with a grey and drowned look to his skin and a boxy form to his skull with very close-cut short hair. His teeth have been capped cheaply using steel. Bond ultimately deals with these two hoods, though not without issue. His first attempt fails, but he ultimately winds up shooting Horror when the hoods try to run him down in their car. Horror's body jams the accelerator and sends the car into a lake. Slugsy manages to get out because Bond wound up leaving them thinking they would both die, and tries to ambush Bond and Vivienne at the end of the book, but he's finally silenced then. These two hoodlums would, in a way, provide the inspiration for Jaws and Sandor, Stromberg's henchmen in the movie The Spy Who Loved Me. The final major antagonist not involved in Spectre, and not counting short stories, is Francisco Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun. Scaramanga is more of a mobster figure in the book. He is still a notorious assassin, but he does come across as more a crude gangster than anything else. His backstory is extensively laid out in his file, with a few fairly outdated psychological elements thrown in. It's mentioned that Scaramanga started his life in a circus and became a capable trick shot and elephant tamer. He abandoned this pursuit after his favourite elephant was killed. It went berserk due to an issue with its mating processes and the biology involved, certain mucus build-up behind its ears irritating it and causing it significant distress. And while it was ultimately restrained on its rampage and returned to Scaramanga, the elephant was shot and killed. Scaramanga killed the policeman who fired the fatal shots and went on the run. He apparently worked for the Spangled Mob for a while as a hired gun, before fleeing to the Caribbean after killing his opposite number from the Detroit Purple Gang in a duel. He built up real estate investments in the area for not only mafia funding but communism in Cuba as well, ostensibly working for Batista, but spending a lot of time working with Castro's secret police. Subsequently, Scaramanga's scheme involves using this cover of real estate investment to strengthen Cuban and Soviet interests in and around the Caribbean, disrupting a number of existing operations, with the hotel at which the group's convention is set being something of a centrepiece. The involvement of the criminal gangs allows their holdings to be strengthened too. The golden gun in the novel is actually a gold-plated revolver firing silver bullets. The bullets have what is termed a dum-dum cross cut in the nose, causing them to flatten on impact for maximum wounding capacity. Its ostentatiousness seems almost contrary to the idea of Scaramanga being a professional killer, though he does have a backup in the form of a derringer with poison-coated bullets. The climax of the book, set atop a tourist train the group is undertaking as part of Scaramanga's recruitment/entertainment package, sees Scaramanga escape the trap Felix Leiter sets up at Bond's behest. Leiter believed he had incapacitated the assassin, but despite his wounds, Scaramanga was able to jump off the train. The various hoodlums are either shot during the ride or killed when explosives on a bridge detonate and send the train crashing into a ravine. Bond ultimately kills Scaramanga, though it's a close call. Bond's willingness to let Scaramanga say final prayers gets him shot by the Derringer, though in the throes of pain from the bullet and venom, Bond shoots Scaramanga several times. Bond, of course, survives. The final antagonistic force, at least as we can consider a typical assassin, since Octopussy doesn't have a true antagonist as such, and Smersh is sort of the nebulous presence in the background during Property of a Lady, is the mysterious assassin Trigger, a Soviet agent sent to kill MI6 agent 272 during a border crossing in Berlin. This, of course, is the living daylights I'm talking about here. Bond keeps watch for Trigger, only to find the assassin is not only female, but the beautiful cellist he'd been observing on occasion from his vantage point. The role of the cello player was a cover to be able to carry the weapon around, a bit more elaborate than a violin case. Bond shoots the assault rifle from her hands instead of killing her, allowing 272 to eventually make it across. When questioned, he remarks that either way her career is finished. The wound to her hands will hamper her shooting, and the emotional impact scared the living daylights out of her. It's portrayed very differently in the movie. But there you go, a bit of a teaser to the various villains that Ian Fleming wrote. We have a pretty big selection of antagonists, most of which seem to have some sort of grudge against Britain as opposed to America, and James Bond does wind up dealing with a lot of threats all over the world. Next time, we're going to be going a bit more into the literary world after Ian Fleming. Whew-wee! Scraped in with a little bit to spare. Well, that was a bit risky, but let's go look at our cheat. 2 times rocket launchers. So we will put on some of our usual cheats and go fall around with this one, even if there's not much we can do. Now, I do just want to check something. So, of course, we've got our big head. Let's see. Let's flick over. The rocket launcher does not appear in our menu. That's weird. The same thing happened with the grenade launchers. It doesn't appear in our menu. We switch to it, but it lists me as being unarmed. That's bizarre. Nice big explosion. And that is it. We're just about out of ammunition. So the rocket launchers can be very useful, but the fact that they've got very limited ammunition is also a problem unless you use very specific cheats. Can I destroy these? Yes, I can. Ah, yes, this particular character model. Excuse me, I'm trying to concentrate. But yes, this particular character model is Grant Kirkhope. As I mentioned earlier, all of the developers actually have their faces as randomly selected enemy faces because the N64 didn't have that many textures. So this is Grant's. Sorry, champ. So if you have encountered the bald enemy, I think the bald model is used for one of the civilians. I think it's the third civilian that's the bald one, but that's Graham Norgates, the other composer for this game. Well, in all fairness, there is technically a third because Robin Beanland composed one of the elevator tracks. And Boris just sort of wandered in the way. Oh well, that's going to spare everyone a lot of trouble. And there's David Doak. So yeah, I don't know all of them, but I did, thanks to looking observing things online, recognise which ones were Graham Norgate and which one was Grant Kirkhope. So that's a pretty cool touch, in all fairness. We can just wind up wrapping everything up. I might have to do a little bit of padding along the way, because this wound up admittedly being a little... Well, I've probably put all my failed efforts in as padding. Now, I will show this though. You might have noticed the black-clad guards turning up. We'll fight a few of those later on. We get an unlimited supply of guards. They are fairly dangerous under normal circumstances. But nothing we can't handle since we're invincible. Can't use the rocket launcher. So, you can see these. This is actually the uniform of some guards we're going to meet quite a bit later. You'll notice how they take a bit more damage. They'll take a few extra shots to kill even on easy. So you'll often have enemies appearing from nowhere in a constant stream if you set an alarm off. That's why I kept respawning, because that constant barrage of enemies is just a bit too much to deal with. Anyway, we're all done there. So that wraps that up for the bunker. We've done everything we need to. Let's deactivate our cheats, and next time I will be heading into the silo, which is a bit of a longer one. Thank you very much for joining me. Till next time, this is Red 2, returning to base.